Rabotai, good morning. Bezrat Hashem, made this class be in Refuah Shleima for my grandmother, Barucho Bat Saram. The Shulchan Aruch in Siman Nun Bet and Halach Aleph continues. He's going to speak about today what happens if a person sees he doesn't even have enough time to be able to say Baruch Shamar, Tehillah LeDavid and Yishtabach. He walks into the shul, he puts on his tefillin, he sees they're already beginning from Baruch Hu, from the Berachot of Kriyat Shema. Says the Shulchan Aruch, V'im kvar hidchilu hatzibur yotzer, if the congregation already began the blessing of Yotzer, which is right after Baruch Hu, V'en shahud lomar Pesukei de Zimra afilu bidiluk, you're not able to say Pesukei de Zimra even through the skipping process. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Yikra Kriyat Shema u'berchotech im hatzibur v'yitpalal imahem. Read the Kriyat Shema with its blessing, with the before blessings and after blessings, and daven with them. V'achar kach yikra kol Pesukei de Zimra b'lo beracha shel avnechem v'lo shel acharechem. And afterwards, once you finish davening, you're going to go back and you're going to go ahead and you're going to do the Pesukei de Zimra. But Rabotai, when it comes to the blessing of Baruch Shamar and the blessing of Yishtabach, you're not going to be able to say them with Barachot. You lost that out. So says the Shulchan Aruch, a person walks into the shul and you see the congregation, they began the blessing of Yotzer Or. We're going to tell you over there, Rabotai, you see you don't have time to be able to say the whole Pesukei de Zimra in skipping fashion. Begin with them, say the Barachot, say the Kriyat Shema, Emet v'Yativ, daven Shomna Esrei, finish the davening, eventually go back and do the whole Pesukei de Zimra again. But Rabotai, do not say the blessings of Pesukei de Zimra and Yishtabach. Oh yeah, I'm saying Baruch Shamar and Yishtabach, yeah. The two blessings in the Baruch Shamar and Yishtabach, correct. So Hiruri could do it. Hiruri could do it. You can think it in your mind, but you shouldn't say it. Okay. Rabotai, we're continuing over here today. In the Sefer Elam Mishra, we're going to speak about Yir Shamayim. We're still on the subject. He brings on over here and he says that Divrei Chaim Misanz Amar, the Divrei Chaim from Sanz, he said, Mina Shamayim, from heaven, Ratu laharod ledorot ha'achronim, they wanted to show to the later generations, Dugma ke'en tano. They wanted to show us something that is similar to what does the Tana look like. Right? When you look at Gemara, you have Tanaim, correct? They want to show you like, what's a Tanam? So who do you think Hashem sent into our generation? V'lachen shalchu lanu et ha'gaon Rabbi Eliyahu Mevilna, the Gaon Mevilna. They sent him to us to show us what's considered to be a Tanam. Siper HaDivrei Chaim, he says that he gave us over here a story. Shepam achad nichnesa lechadro eiza yalda. One time, some girl entered into his room. Upachad mi isun yichud. Rabotai, same thing like we saw before. And he got scared from the prohibition of being secluded alone with a girl. V'teikav umyad kafas min hachalon lachutz b'li lachshov im yistaken al yedei zeh o lo. Immediately he jumped from outside from his window without taking into consideration if that's going to damage him or not. He didn't think two times. Rabotai, why? Says the Divrei HaChaim, you understand what means Tana, you know why they were able to remember Torah, why they were able to be attached to Hashem. Why? Rabotai, this was the great fear of heaven from the Gaon Mevilna. This is how much fear of heaven they had. When a person is able to come close to Hashem and understand that He's the one that's in charge, in the end you have to give an accounting to Him. When you build your Yir Shamayim, Rabotai, mitzvot are no longer a question, should I do it or not? I don't have that battle, should I do it or not? If the Gaon Mevilna who was like a holy Tana, Pachad mi'isur yichud im yalda. He was afraid from the prohibition of being secluded with a girl. Ma ne'amar anu rabotai, what should we say? What should we answer? Ad kama tzerichim anu livroch mi'isur ze. How much we have to run away from this prohibition of being secluded with women? Kemo esh lohet ha'alula lechalot kol chelkato rabotai. You have to understand. This being secluded with a woman is like being in a fire where it's able to consume and destroy everything that you have. But Rabotai, there's a bigger problem over here. When you seclude yourself with a woman, you put yourself at risk of losing all the good that Hashem can bless you with. This, Rabotai, is Yiras Shamayim. This is something, when you see something Chas v'Shalom goes against the way of Hashem, even if it infringes on your boundary a little bit, you run away from it. He brings down over here also another story. Hagaon Rabbi Michal Yehuda Lefkowitz Shlita Kvar Zatzal Hayagar beBechurato beVolosh Rabotai. Rabbi Michal Yehuda Lefkowitz, he used to live when he was young, when he was a bachur, when he was a teenager, he used to live in Volozhin. Vaya nosei lelmod beVilna, and he would travel to learn in Vilna. Pam achad nasal yeshiva, one day he was traveling to the yeshiva. V'hina mikabelet imo hodoah. His mother gets a telephone call, a message. Ma'yeshiva shebana niftzaa kashe begufo, that the child, he got damaged very badly in his body. Rabota, what happened? He's darzah ha'em ubal yeshiva kedei lerod ma matzav bana. She came to the yeshiva to see what's going on with the child. What happened? I sent him to yeshiva and he got a bodily damage. Kesherata oto shalom makara. When she saw him, she asked him, what happened? What happened to you? Siper la bana. The son explained to her. He told her the story. She berachavet, when they were driving in the train. Nigasha elav goya achat. Rabotai, one goya came to him. V'niseta latchil ito. She started playing with him. Right, she wanted to start with him. V'tzikala, and as she started pressuring him, he felt very uncomfortable. Keshera'ah kach. When he saw this, avar l'karon Hashem, he went to the second wagon. Ach oto mersha'at avra gam hi l'sham. That evil girl also went with him to the second wagon. Ve'az keshera'ah she'en lo berer, when he saw that he had no other choice, kafaz me'harav, he jumped from the train. V'lachen neftzah beguf. That's why he damaged his body. I don't know, maybe he broke his leg or his hands, but he broke something, Rabotai. Rabotai, this is Yiras Shamayim. Not like today, Chas v'Shalom, Rabotai, you have a girl come to you, you sit there, you flirt with her, hi, bye, give me your number, take my number, yeah, I'll meet you after, Rabotai, it's a very big problem. Rabotai, unfortunately, people, they flirt very much, especially at the workplaces, right, in stores. You see sometimes men that they never speak, their wives say that they never speak at home. I don't know if that's true or not, because they always speak to other girls. I don't know how that makes sense to me. They're always speaking with other girls with a nice smile. She has a nice smile. He has a nice smile. And before you know, they both have nice children. Rabotai, we have to ask ourselves a question. How is it possible, like we just saw in these stories, that they had Yiras Shamayim? Right? And also I want to read for you Gimel Masechet Berachot and Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Bet, where it speaks about Moshe Rabbeinu, how come he was able to have Yiras Shamayim. We know that Hashem will never test anybody with nothing or with anything if he knows you're not going to be able to overcome it, correct? If fear of heaven is such a hard thing, so why did Hashem give it to us? If you have no fear of heaven, you have nothing. So that means we could do it. So why aren't we doing it? Says the Gemara, Rabotai, Rabbi Chanina said, Hakol b'dei shamayim chutz miyiras shamayim. Everything is in the hands of heaven except the fear of heaven. Shamata Ronen, lo shamata. Be'emet, shamata, lo shamata. What does this mean to say? That everything is already preordained except if I'm going to be a tzaddik or a rasha, if I'm going to make the right choices or not. That's the only thing that's in my hand. Everything else, yes, you have to do your ishtadlut because that's the curse from Adam and Chava when they ate from the Etz Hadat. Fine, we have to do our ishtadlut. But already everything is preordained. What do? We kill ourselves for everything else and we leave it at AVODAT HASHEM. Says Rabbi Chanina, "Kol b'dei shamayim chutz mi'yirut shamayim." Everything is in the hands of heaven except the fear of heaven. How do we know, Rabotai? Shenema, like the pasuk says, "V'ata Yisrael ma Hashem l'kecha shel mi'imach ki im lira'ah." What does Hashem only ask from you? Rabotai, what does Hashem want from us? He wants us to fear Him. Do you think Hashem wants us to learn His Torah without fear? Like Chas v'shalom science or history or math? No. You think Hashem wants us to do His mitzvah by rote? Absolutely not. He wants us to be able to fear Him, Rabotai. Says the Gemara, 1 second. Atu yiras shamayim milta sutri. What, is yiras shamayim a small thing? V'amar Rabbi Chanina mishur Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, because didn't Rabbi Chanina say in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Elo l'kadosh baruch hu bebeit ganazav elo otzar shel yiras shamayim. All Hashem has, Rabotai, in His treasure house is the fear of heaven alone. Shenema, like the pasuk says, yirat Hashem hi otzaro. That fear of God is His treasure. So the question is, Rabotai, what is yiras shamayim such a small thing? The Gemara says, yes, it is. But to who? L'gabi Moshe. By Moshe Rabbeinu, milta zutrahi, it's a small thing, Rabotai. By Moshe Rabbeinu, it's a small thing. Now, Rabotai, I want to ask you a question. Why by Moshe Rabbeinu, fear of heaven is a small thing? What happened? He said, why by Moshe? Why? Nobody else has fear of heaven? Why only by Moshe Rabbeinu? Rabotai, if we look, right, we say in Shacharit, in the morning prayer, what do we say over there? Yisamach Moshe, b'matanat chelko. You ready for this, Rabotai? Ki eved ne'eman karatolo, because Hashem called him a faithful servant. Rabotai, this is the secret how one becomes a true Eved Hashem. Yiras shamayim. How do you gain yiras shamayim? When you are a true Eved. What is an Eved, Rabotai? Does anybody know what an Eved does? Ah, beautiful, beautiful. Eved doesn't ask questions. If it's supposed to be done, I get it done. That's an Eved. Only get it, okay, you said that I'm not going to do it. I'll do it later. I'll do it tomorrow. He doesn't ask this. He knows he has a master and he's the Eved. Rabotai, what happens over here? If we realize that we are Eved and we have a master, we're going to be able to serve Hashem better. But a lot of times, Rabotai, what happens throughout the day? Or when we're, Rabotai, on vacation places where we're not supposed to, we forget about Hashem. We're no longer an Eved. We become the masters. So therefore, who says I have to listen to him? That's what, Rabotai, if a person really wants to be able to work on his yiras shamayim, he has to first understand, Rabotai, that he's an Eved. He's the slave of this world. Rabotai, you don't believe it? I'll make it very simple. Give yourself some time or go to a hospital. Visit any hospital. See how many people die every single day. What do they take with themselves in the end? Huh? מה אתה לוקח, ארתור, איתך? אשתך, ילדים, הם אומרים תודה לך, אולי לא, אולי כן. מה אתה חושב? Rabotai, we work so hard. I'm not telling people not to work. We work so hard on the materialistic things in this world. House, car, vacation. Make sure everybody's happy, everybody's happy, everybody's happy. But we forget the most important person that has to be happy in order for him to be able to have a good olam haba, and that's ourselves. Rabotai, a person has to incorporate into his life. First comes Hashem. Artur, shamata? Lo shamata. Katuv, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, lo ishtecha. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am Hashem. First, that's you know how they say, Miljon, happy life. Finish in Miljon, happy wife. Everybody knows this. I don't say this in Miljon. You have to say it like this in Miljon. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's a clear chazal, by the way. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu is happy with you, then everybody else is going to be happy with you. Even your own enemies, you understand? We have to try to make Hashem happy. How do we make Hashem happy, Menachem? By being real Avdei Hashem. When you don't ask questions and you start doing, I want to, I don't want to, yes, no, maybe I'll learn today, maybe I'm not. Rabotai, you gotta push yourself. Time is running, there's one thing that won't wait for you, and that's time. Rabotai, it doesn't wait for you. You guys, look at yourselves today. You're already 40, 50. People say, Rabbi, we have a lot of time. Rabotai, people don't have time. I tell Rabbi, people don't have time. 60, Rabotai, is half of 120. Let's say you make it to 70. Let's say you make it to 80. What, you'd be like a bull when you're 80 years old? Absolutely not, Rabotai. That means if you're right now already 50, you have if Hashem gives you up to 60, you have under 10 years to live. If He gives you up to 80, you have, Rabotai, another 20 years to live, Rabotai. What are we doing? Who are we waiting? Same 50 years that passed you like this, another 50 years is going to pass you like this, Rabotai. Do not let this goal of fearing Hashem the proper way slip your mind. Baruch Adonai Olam. Amen. Amen. Rabbi Chaim Igal, Torah